I had just come back from another long day, the kind where your shoulders ache from carrying too much weight, and your mind keeps replaying all the little failures you couldn't quite shake off. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan. I was halfway through dropping my keys on the counter when I heard a soft knock at the door. It wasn't the kind of knock that demanded. It was gentle, hesitant almost, but unmistakably hers. My landlady. I opened the door to find her standing there in the hallway, her figure outlined by the amber glow of the overhead light. She was in her early 40s, though the way she carried herself had a timeless grace that made age seem irrelevant. That night, her hair was loosely tied back, a few strands falling forward to frame her face. Her expression, though, caught me off guard. Usually she greeted me with a polite smile, that firm but kind demeanor of someone who kept everything in order. But tonight was different. There was something softer in her eyes, something tired, as if the weight of the evening pressed down harder on her than usual. Rent night, I thought instantly, bracing myself. Money was always tight, and though she was never unkind about it, I hated the feeling of being reminded. But before I could reach for my wallet, she spoke. Her voice was low, steady, but carrying a vulnerability I had never heard from her before. No rent tonight, she said, shaking her head slightly. Then, after the smallest pause, she added, pay me in a different way. The words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I wasn't sure I heard her right. My heart gave a sudden, uneven beat. Her tone wasn't teasing. It wasn't demanding. It was something else entirely, quiet, almost pleading, though her composure never fully cracked. I stood there, frozen, unsure what she meant. My mind raced through a dozen possibilities, but none seemed to fit the look in her eyes. There was no sly smile, no sharpness. Just a woman standing in her own doorway, asking for something I didn't yet understand. I swallowed, the silence stretching uncomfortably. What do you mean? I finally managed, my voice quieter than I intended. She tilted her head slightly, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of her lips, not playful, but weary. Just, not money. Not tonight. Her gaze held mine, steady but vulnerable, and I realized this wasn't about rent at all. She wasn't asking for anything I could fold into an envelope or hand across the threshold. She was asking for something else. Something unspoken. And in that moment, with the faint scent of jasmine drifting from her apartment behind her and the cool night air settling between us, I felt the first stirrings of curiosity, and something more dangerous. Because for the first time, my landlady didn't feel like just my landlady. She felt like someone reaching out, across a boundary neither of us had ever dared to cross. Her words lingered in my chest long after she spoke them. Not money. Not tonight. I stood in the doorway, caught between confusion and curiosity, searching her face for answers she didn't give. Then, with a small motion of her hand, she gestured toward her apartment. Come sit with me for a while, she said softly. I don't want to be alone tonight. There was no force in her voice, only honesty. And something about the way she said it, stripped of the usual layers of formality she always carried, made it impossible for me to refuse. I followed her inside. Her apartment always carried a certain elegance, but tonight it felt warmer than usual. A single lamp by the sofa cast a golden glow across the room. A candle burned quietly on the coffee table, the faint scent of jasmine threading through the air. It was simple, intimate, and unexpectedly inviting. She moved gracefully, as if even in her tiredness she couldn't help but carry herself with poise. Tea, she asked, already reaching for the porcelain cups she kept neatly arranged. I nodded, unsure of what else to do. When she handed me the cup, her fingers brushed against mine. It wasn't deliberate, not exactly, but she didn't pull away quickly either. The contact was light, almost imperceptible, yet it sent a quiet ripple through me. Her skin was warm, soft. My hand tightened instinctively around the cup, and I prayed she couldn't see how it unsettled me. We sat across from each other at first, the silence stretching just a little too long. I caught myself studying her, the faint lines near her eyes, softened by the glow of the lamp. The way she held her cup gently, as though savoring the warmth more than the taste. She was beautiful, but in a way that carried weight. Not the fleeting beauty of youth, but something steadier, deeper. Finally, she broke the silence. "Sometimes," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her cup, "this place feels so big. Too big for just one person." I wasn't sure what to say. I took a sip of tea to give myself time, the jasmine notes lingering on my tongue. "I know what you mean," I said at last. "It's strange, isn't it? You can be surrounded by walls, by everything you need, and still feel like something's missing." Her eyes lifted to mine then, and for a heartbeat, we just looked at each other. There was no pity in her gaze, no judgment. Only recognition. She leaned back slightly, a breath escaping her. "That's exactly it." The air between us shifted. The small room, the golden light, the gentle weight of her words, it all drew us closer, though neither of us had moved. I realized then what she had wanted all along. Not money. Not favors. Just presence. Just someone willing to sit across from her in the quiet and see her not as the landlady, but as a woman who, for one night, didn't want to be alone. And somehow, that felt heavier and far more dangerous than any rent I could ever pay. The tea had cooled by the time our words began to flow. At first, the conversation was light, simple questions, polite answers. She asked about my work, about how I managed long hours on such little pay. I shrugged it off, trying to make it sound easier than it was. But she had a way of looking at me, steady and unblinking, that made me feel like she could see right past the surface. "Don't minimize your struggle," she said gently, her lips curving in the faintest smile. "It's harder to be young than people admit. You're always told you have time, but no one says how heavy the waiting can be." I didn't know how to respond, but her words lodged somewhere deep inside me. She leaned back on the sofa, her cup resting in her hands. For the first time since I had met her, she began to share pieces of her own story. Not as the landlady, not as someone in charge, but as a woman. She told me about her marriage, how it had ended quietly, without drama, just two people drifting so far apart that even silence had become unbearable. She spoke of the years since then, of the strange loneliness that lingered even when life looked orderly from the outside. Her voice didn't break, but there were moments it thinned, like a candle flickering against a draft. I listened, more carefully than I'd ever listened to anyone before. When she fell quiet, I found myself speaking too, telling her things I rarely admitted aloud. How I felt like I was always running, working to stay afloat, never quite finding a place where I could rest. I confessed that some nights I lay awake, wondering if I was already failing at life before it had even properly begun. She laughed then, not cruelly, but softly, shaking her head. "You're not failing," she said. "You're just starting. The middle always feels far away when you're still at the beginning." Her words were comforting in a way I hadn't expected. It was strange, I was supposed to be the tenant, the one in need of stability, yet here we were, offering each other pieces of reassurance that neither of us had found elsewhere. The night stretched on. The clock ticked, unnoticed. Between our stories were silences, but they weren't empty. They were full of glances that lingered too long, of breaths we both seemed afraid to release too loudly. At one point, she smiled at something I said, a real smile that reached her eyes. For a second, she held my gaze, and in that unguarded look I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, longing, delicate but undeniable. Then she blinked, lowered her eyes, and the moment was gone. But the silence that followed wasn't the same as before. It carried weight, an invisible thread pulling tighter between us. And as I sat there, heart unsteady, I realized that what began as a simple conversation was turning into something far more dangerous, a closeness neither of us had planned, but both of us had already stepped into. The hours slipped away almost unnoticed, the room carrying that quiet magic that comes when two people realize they are no longer strangers. The lamp still cast its warm glow across the living room, and the jasmine candle had burned low, its fragrance softer now but still lingering in the air like a secret. At some point, our positions shifted. She had started the evening sitting across from me, carefully measured in the space she left between us. But little by little, the distance had closed. A story of hers had led to laughter, and when she leaned forward to emphasize a detail, she didn't retreat as far back as before. And when I replied, I leaned in too, matching her without thinking. Before I knew it, she was sitting beside me on the sofa, the fabric of her sleeve brushing lightly against mine. The contact was subtle, accidental at first, but she didn't move away. I could feel the warmth of her presence, not just her body, but her nearness, her breath, the faint trace of jasmine that seemed to cling to her skin. It made my own breaths uneven, though I tried to disguise it. She tilted her head, letting out a soft laugh at something I'd said. The movement sent a few loose strands of hair falling across her face. Instinctively, my hand twitched, the impulse to brush them back startling me. But I caught myself, fingers tightening against my knee instead. She must have noticed. Her eyes flicked toward my hand for the briefest moment, and then she tucked the strands back herself, slow and graceful, her fingertips lingering at her temple as though aware I'd been watching. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged. She reached for her teacup again, and as she set it back down on the table, her hand came to rest for just a second on my knee. It was the lightest touch, a fleeting press of her fingers, almost as if she didn't realize she'd done it. But my body reacted instantly. A current ran through me, sharp and undeniable, and my heart stumbled in my chest. I didn't look at her right away, afraid of what I'd find in her eyes. When I finally did, she was already looking at me. There was nothing casual in her gaze. It was steady, searching, with a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The room was speaking for us, in the closeness of our shoulders, in the warmth of her touch still lingering on my knee, in the unspoken question hanging heavy between us. I wanted to close the space completely, to let the electricity between us finally burn into something undeniable. But my thoughts raced. She's older. She's my landlady. This is a line I shouldn't cross. And yet, the smallest touches had already crossed it for us. The air between us grew heavy after that touch, as though the entire room had shifted its weight onto our shoulders. I could still feel the ghost of her fingers against my knee, a warmth that refused to fade. My mind should have been clear. I should have stood, thanked her for the tea, and gone back to my apartment before the night grew too complicated. But my body betrayed me. I stayed rooted to the sofa, unable to move away. She must have felt it too. For a long moment, she didn't speak, her gaze lowered, her hand resting loosely in her lap. Then, almost as if catching herself, she drew her hand back, folding her arms across her chest like a barrier. The sudden distance was small, but I felt it sharply, as though a door had been closed. I looked at her, trying to read the expression she tried so carefully to mask. Her lips pressed together, her jaw tense, her eyes focused on some invisible point across the room. "We shouldn't," she whispered, the words barely audible. Her voice startled me more than if she'd shouted. The way she said it, not firm, not decisive, but hesitant, as though she was trying to convince herself. I swallowed, unsure how to answer. "I know," I said quietly. And I did know. She was my landlady. She was older, wiser, with responsibilities I couldn't begin to understand. And I was, just me. Too young, too unsteady, with nothing to offer except my presence. The logical part of me screamed that she was right. That whatever was pulling us closer was something we should both resist. And yet, another part of me, the part that remembered the loneliness in her eyes when she knocked on my door, the softness in her voice when she asked me to sit with her, couldn't accept pulling away. The silence stretched painfully. The candle flickered low, casting shadows across her face, making her look almost fragile despite the quiet strength she always carried. I wanted to reach for her, to tell her she didn't have to keep holding everything inside, but my own doubts held me back. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her own words pressed down too hard. "People wouldn't understand," she murmured. There it was, the unspoken truth. Not just the years between us, not just our roles, but the way others would see it. Judgment, whispers, questions neither of us wanted to answer. Her eyes flicked to mine then, and for just a heartbeat, I saw the war inside her. The longing that mirrored my own, colliding with the walls she'd built around herself. And in that look, I understood, this wasn't a simple refusal. It was a hesitation, a battle between what she felt and what she believed she should feel. I sat there, torn between leaving and staying, between honoring the boundaries and wanting to break them. My chest ached with the weight of it. And as the silence wrapped tighter around us, I realized we were both teetering on the edge of something that could change everything if only one of us dared to move first. The silence was suffocating. Every second that passed seemed to tighten the invisible thread between us until I could hardly breathe. My eyes kept flicking to her hands, folded tightly in her lap, knuckles pale from the pressure she put on them. She looked strong, composed as always, yet the small betrayals of her body told a different story, the way her shoulders rose and fell a little too quickly, the way she pressed her lips together as if keeping words locked inside. And then, as though something inside her finally gave way, she reached across the narrow space between us. Slowly, almost cautiously, her fingers brushed against mine, then settled over my hand. The contact was so light at first I almost thought I imagined it. But then her hand tightened, her palm warm against my skin, her touch trembling just enough to betray the courage it had taken. I froze, my chest aching with the weight of the moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than I had ever heard it, a whisper that carried every bit of her vulnerability. "Sometimes," she said, eyes fixed on the candlelight instead of me, "I just need to feel that I'm not invisible." The words hit me like a stone dropped into still water. Invisible. The idea that this woman who carried herself with so much grace, who seemed so composed, so untouchable, could feel unseen, unnoticed, unseen by the world, it shook me. I turned my hand over, lacing my fingers gently through hers, and held on. Not tightly, not possessively, but firmly enough to tell her she wasn't reaching into empty space. "You're anything but invisible to me," I whispered. My voice cracked slightly, the truth of it pressing too hard against my chest. Her head turned slowly, and for the first time that night, her eyes met mine without hesitation. They shone in the dim light not just with sadness, but with relief, with something raw and unguarded. A small breath escaped her, almost a laugh but edged with emotion. And then, without words, she shifted closer. Her body leaned into mine until her head came to rest lightly against my shoulder. I felt her weight settle, warm and steady, her cheek pressed near my collarbone. My arm moved instinctively, sliding around her back, pulling her gently closer. The fabric of her blouse brushed against my skin, and beneath it, I could feel the faint, rhythmic steadiness of her breathing. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The silence that earlier had felt suffocating now wrapped around us like a blanket, softer, safer. Her hand remained in mine, her fingers curled loosely, and every so often, her thumb moved a small, absent-minded stroke against my knuckle that made my heart stumble. For the first time that night, I stopped fighting the pull between us. I let myself feel it, the closeness, the tenderness, the simple but overwhelming truth that in that moment, we were exactly where we both needed to be. And as her breathing slowed against my shoulder, I knew this was no longer about rent, or boundaries, or roles. It was about two people finding something they hadn't even known they were missing, and finally letting themselves reach for it. Time became strange after that, as though the world outside her apartment no longer existed. We sat there, close, wrapped in a silence that was no longer heavy but warm, almost protective. Her head rested against my shoulder, her hands still entwined with mine, and every so often I felt the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. It was a rhythm that steadied me, made me forget, for a moment, the doubts that had gnawed at us earlier. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Minutes, hours, it all blurred together. But eventually, she stirred. Her head lifted slowly from my shoulder, her eyes blinking as though waking from a dream she didn't want to leave. "I should let you go," she said softly, though her tone lacked conviction. Her hand remained in mine even as she spoke, her fingers reluctant to release. I shook my head lightly. "I don't mind staying." A smile tugged at her lips then, small, tired, but undeniably tender. "You've already given me more than I asked for," she whispered. Still, she rose, and I followed, our hands parting only when we reached the doorway of her apartment. The lamp behind her cast a soft halo of light around her figure, and in that moment she looked both impossibly strong and quietly fragile, as if she was balancing between two versions of herself. We stood there, neither of us ready to break the spell. My chest ached with the weight of everything I wanted to say but couldn't. And then, almost shyly, she stepped forward. Her arm slipped around my waist, tentative at first, then firmer as she drew me into her. I felt the warmth of her body against mine, the softness of her cheek resting lightly against my chest. My own arms moved around her, holding her as though letting go too soon would undo everything that had happened tonight. For a moment, it was just us, her heartbeat steady against me, the faint scent of jasmine clinging to her hair, the quiet hush of the night wrapping around us like a promise. When she finally spoke, her voice was muffled against me, almost as if she didn't want the words to escape too loudly. "This is the only rent I wanted, your company." My throat tightened. It wasn't just a line, not just something kind to say. It was the truth, raw, simple, and more valuable than anything money could have offered. I held her closer, wishing I could freeze the moment, but eventually she pulled back. Her eyes shone in the dim light, not with tears, but with a softness that seemed to reach past every wall she'd kept around herself. We exchanged no promises, no declarations. Just a long, lingering look that carried more weight than words ever could. And when I finally stepped out into the quiet hallway, my heart was racing, my palms still tingling from her touch. The door closed gently behind me, but the night had left its mark. Something had shifted in her, in me, in whatever bound us together now. And I knew, as I stood there in the silence of my own apartment, that no rent I could ever pay would matter as much as the closeness we had shared that night.